as the crow flies on the Vance Crowe Podcast.
John Boelts, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Vance. Good to see you today, sir.
You are in the strangest location of any guest I've ever had on the podcast. What is behind you?
Well, behind us here today, we've got a iceberg lettuce harvest happening as we speak. They started here about an hour and a half ago, packing 24-count boxes that you would see coming in the back of restaurants or supermarkets all over the U.S. and Canada.
So tell the listeners what your background is. What is it that you do? Why are you standing in front of a lettuce field right now?
So these are my crops. We work with 5 different West Coast produce shippers that ship fresh produce all over the U.S. and Canada. It's a lot of work to make sure we have it all ready to harvest each day when they ask for it to be ready to harvest. That's a several-month process that we work with our shipper partners on, and they literally do. They want to be harvesting every day, and we try to make sure that we plan 3 months in advance. We're working on various different steps, and then the last 2 to 3 months is growing the crop to produce it. So that's my day job, and then I volunteer with Arizona Farm Bureau doing advocacy work with Arizona and American Farm Bureau. And I guess that's how we've gotten to know each other. But yeah, my day job is farming lettuce and other vegetables and other crops when we're done with the vegetable crop, like fresh melons and other things we're growing all year here in Yuma, Arizona.
So we've known each other for years, but it would not have been for the pandemic of coronavirus that's going on right now that got us talking. I saw you on Twitter talking about labor issues, and I wanted to give you a chance to explain to people all over the country, really all over the world, what is going on with labor in light of coronavirus and where you're at. Maybe a good place to start is, where are you and how do you get your labor right now?
So most of the folks that work with us, not exclusively, but most of the folks, the vast majority, are first or second generation immigrants into the United States. Most of them come with a background in agriculture of some kind, most of them from Mexico. And they're tractor drivers, irrigators, and of course the harvesters, like you see using knives in the background behind us, and packaging and getting the lettuce ready to move to the coolers. And most of the people in my segment of the industry are temporary guest workers, first or second generation immigrants from Mexico. And we're really blessed to have a wonderful labor supply. We're not completely unique in that. Across the United States, a lot of agriculture has been blessed with these temporary guest workers or first and second generation immigrants coming into the country and doing invaluable work that we just simply couldn't put the beverages or food on people's table without them. They're essential to our businesses. It's been a long road. Over the last 30 years, 20 to 30 years, we've been advocating for Congress to dramatically change how we let folks come into this country, to immigrate into the country and to work in this country, to change both labor and immigration laws to drastically improve our labor situation, particularly in agriculture. We haven't made hardly any progress with that. And so we have a fairly broken system, and that's what kind of got us talking yesterday about that very topic and how coronavirus is impacting our fragile and poorly designed labor system for agriculture.
So tell us about that. Coronavirus starts becoming part of the news. When does it start impacting lettuce harvest for you?
Well, as you might imagine, if you have a really bad system, then you throw uncertainty, human disease, things like that into the system, it worries you immediately. We have such a fragile system. Let me describe that. Let's talk right here in my local community. We have about 50,000 people working in production agriculture, helping produce the various crops that we farm here in this community, which impacts the entire U.S. and Canada with fresh vegetables, seed crops, lots of different things, forage crops, all kinds of different stuff. But a lot of the things that we grow, like you see happening behind me, they're hand harvested, they're hand tended. We don't have big harvest equipment to harvest fresh lettuce. We've been working on mechanizing, but we're a long ways from that. Consumer expectations are that the product look and be perfect in every way. And there's really only one way you get there, and that's hand selected, hand harvested for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
So,
think most people realize that the way you harvest this is with rows of lettuce and somebody bent over getting every single one of them cut and then put into a bag and then placed in there. It is really difficult work.
absolutely. I'm much slower, and actually where I'm and myself and the camera are this morning, we've got lettuce right here. So those folks cut that lettuce right off the ground, trim the wrapper leaves off, wrap that head up like that, and put it into a carton. And then the cartons are palletized, and it leaves the machine that those folks are working alongside of. The machine is just a way to transport the pallets and boxes in and out of the field. But to get this lettuce to you, it takes hand tending and hand care. So we have about 50,000 people working here in this community in agriculture. About 15 to 20,000 of those folks travel in and out of our community every winter to come in for the harvest, as it commences in earnest in November and then concludes in the first week in April or the last week in March. And it's extremely labor-intensive work that is done at harvest time. Cauliflower fields that are just a stone's throw from here have leaves that are growing all the way up above people's waists. They're harvesting those cauliflower heads right out of amongst those cauliflower leaves. Lettuce a little bit easier, but like you say, you have to bend over. Not quite as wet of conditions, but certainly laborious and intense. And we just simply couldn't do the work we do. We couldn't get the product on people's plates without those workers. So we have those folks traveling back and forth from Salinas to Yuma seasonally. They'll spend 7-8 months of the year in Salinas, and then 4 to 5 months of the year down here in Yuma. But then we also have about 15,000 folks that cross the border every morning at San Luis, Mexico.
15,000, you said?
Yeah, 15,000 cross the border starting about 3 in the morning till about 5:30 in the morning. And then all those folks take a bus ride out to the field. The whole crew load up on a bus, come to the field. This field behind me has 4 crews here working today. Each crew's about 20 to 30 people. And they're going to man that harvest equipment, swing knives and box and cartonize that lettuce, palletize the cartons, send it on down the line. But yeah, to get all those folks here and get them doing the job, there are folks that want to do these jobs. We just simply don't have a legal mechanism that really works well for industry or the employees. We're stuck with an antiquated system that was designed in the mid-'80s, ultimately designed not to work, called the H-2A program. We've been struggling to working our way through that. That's the only program we have available.
What do you mean it was
lucky? Not all segments of ag have that.
What do you mean it was designed not to work?
In 1980, one of the deals that was cut in the mid 1980s, one of the deals that was cut in Congress was to design a program that would be very finite, very kind of difficult to work with. It would guarantee a lot of things that the workers don't always use, like guarantee housing and different things. And it was kind of designed by labor unions to make sure that the folks that were participating in it weren't going to compete with any domestic jobs. And the reason that deal was cut and the way the program was fashioned was because organized labor felt like they were giving up a lot with the amnesty that was passed by Congress in the mid-1980s that allowed existing workforce to seek amnesty and become legal. We're at that point again in this country where we have millions and millions. Some folks estimate 9, 10, 11 million. I would estimate the numbers probably double that if you take into account agriculture, hospitality, construction, and everything. But here along the border, we have a lot of Border Patrol folks that work here. They're part of our community. They're our neighbors and friends. We're in the land of high enforcement here. All of our labor force is legal. And that's really the way all of agriculture across the country wants their labor supply to be. But right now we're dealing with this difficult, antiquated program called H-2A as a stopgap, and it's not the best Band-Aid in the world, if you know what I mean, to fix a broken system.
And why is coronavirus making this worse? I mean, you had mentioned that it was uncertainty, but are you concerned about the border being closed, or what do you think is going to happen as we go forward?
So there's two different issues that are of a concern to me. H-2A workers don't typically cross the border every day. They're provided housing. Most of them live here in our community. Old converted hotels, different things like that that are their housing. And employers have bought that housing up. They provide that for them. A lot of it goes empty because people will want to live in other places or whatever, but that's kind of beside the point. The reason coronavirus becomes an issue is not so much for the worker that we have today that's participating in the H-2A program, but it's really for future H-2A workers that we're going to need here in a couple months, not just in the lettuce fields of Yuma or Yuma, Arizona, or Salinas, California, but literally all over the country. Whether you have a Christmas tree farm in North Carolina, tree and fruit nut type of person, that farmer that's harvesting tree and fruit and nut crops in Michigan, or apple and cherry folks in Washington, really anything across our fruited land. If you're domestically producing a crop that's high labor intensive and you're working with the H-2A program, you need those folks to come. And the way the H-2A program works is you have to work with 5 different federal bureaucracies, and one of those is the State Department. And through the State Department consulates in other countries, foreign countries like Mexico, they work with those other agencies, private business, private farmers and packers, work with all those different agencies. But that State Department location, the consulates and the embassies there in Mexico, that's where that labor force comes and applies and works out the details of coming to work in our country. And those are being shuttered right now. That's a big concern for us over the long term for all of American agriculture for this year and really every year. It's a big problem, but particularly right now with the threat of coronavirus, State Department is shutting down facilities, and we're trying to figure out how to make that work. And it's a big problem, Vance. And then, of course, our daily workers that aren't part of the commuter workers, as we call them, that come across the border daily, have a legal right to work. Some of them are citizens, some of them are not. But all of them have a legal status to work in this country. Those folks would come across our border daily, and they've shortened the hours at different times at the port of entry. That can be problematic for getting folks to work. And there has been some discussion about potentially closing the border with Mexico, whether the Mexican government or the American government chooses to do that, much like we have going on right now in Canada.
Do you think that's an actual possibility, John?
I think it is. Mexico, I heard on the news today, was finding their first confirmed cases of coronavirus. None of us really knows how this is going to impact our country. But I think we're all preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. In hoping for the best, we've always needed a guest worker program that suited agriculture's needs. This highlights it more than ever. But yeah, I do think it's a possibility. I do know that there are folks like American Farm Bureau and other trade organizations working on this today to make sure that American farmers and ranchers and folks have the labor that they need to do the jobs that they need to do to continue maintaining adequate throughput in our food supply chain. But it is a critical thing, and I know folks are working on it, not just in private sector, but in government as well. And I'm hoping they find a resolution to that soon.
I got to tell you, John, seeing your tweets about the idea that we may not be able to get workers across the border is probably the most frightening thing that I've seen out of all of this coronavirus, because I think I'm pretty well aware if you don't have those workers there on the day they're there to harvest, maybe you have another 24, 48 hours, but you start falling behind and food rots in the fields and we aren't filling up the grocery stores in the way that we need to. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. An iceberg lettuce field, for instance, these two that we're standing here amongst today, they have about a 4-day harvest window to have optimal yield and quality. A couple days before and after that will work, but you get much beyond that and it just doesn't work. And we literally, we're producing for the consumer that's going to be consuming every day. Going to the supermarket, going to restaurants, that sort of thing. Obviously, we're not all going to restaurants today, but we hope we can get the details of that worked out so restaurants can stay in business, institutions can get back to functioning. But ultimately, regardless of where people are at, they should be eating fresh, healthy vegetables as part of their well-rounded diet. And they have they're very perishable, and they have a very short window where you're going to have be within the economic threshold of making it work for a farmer to produce it, a shipper, a marketeer to put it into the marketplace, and a consumer be able to afford it. So having timely harvest is essential. And I think we take for granted in our country, immigrants, the role they play. I hope that people will hear this message and maybe think, consciously about their viewpoints about it. But there are many jobs in this country that get done almost exclusively by immigrants, and they're some of the hardest working, salt of the earth people, just like the rest of us that work in agriculture. And we're thrilled to have them here working with us. They do essential jobs for our food supply.
So, John, this is kind of a tough question to even ask, but I have already heard several people since I started talking about this with the lettuce bringing this up. They say, hey, there are a lot of Americans that are out of work right now. Their hotels are being shuttered, that they're working in their restaurants. Why don't we just have them go do this? What's your perspective on just taking the workforce that's just been knocked out and putting them to work in the fields right now?
Vance, that's a great point, and I imagine some folks that maybe hadn't considered a job in agriculture may very well do that. Historically, though, even through crises times like after 9/11, when employment opportunities contracted and folks were out of work, we didn't see that happen at all. Typically, folks will hang around for quite a while in the marketplace waiting for a job that they think suits them and their lifestyle. Folks behind me are making between $12 and $25 an hour, depending on how they're paid. Some are paid piece rate, so it's how quickly and efficiently they work. And those folks make a very good living doing this. It's laborious, no doubt, but it is a good job, and the camaraderie around the people in agriculture is second to none, as you've found out being around a lot of people in agriculture. So, it's not always beautiful every day out under the sun. Some days are cold, some days are windy. But most of the people that do these jobs, they love the work that they do, and they love working in agriculture, and they appreciate the opportunity, and we certainly couldn't do what we do without them. So while some domestic employees, workers may consider making a job change to agriculture, it seems very unlikely given our history that might really come to fruition. So I think in the last 40, 50 years, we've seen that it's typically those first and second generation immigrants or temporary guest workers that are really interested in doing this work.
Yeah, people working hard to move to another way of life, right? They're moving. They're really, yeah. So, John, how about your family and what's going on in your community? How are people reacting to coronavirus? What have you seen change in the last week that you didn't expect?
So, as an employer, I farm these crops ready to harvest in the field, and my shipper partners bring their crews to harvest and cartonize that product and move it into the marketplace. We have about 40 to 50 employees that work with me to grow these crops ready to harvest. We've implemented some of the advice and recommendations that were passed along by CDC. Some great advice, about a 4-page little worksheet, if you will, that we translated into Spanish and put out to our workers last Friday. We're trying to keep distances of 6 feet. We're trying to make sure that employees that work directly for me aren't moving from one piece of equipment to another, that we keep that person in that piece of equipment. If we have to swap somebody around, we're going to clean that piece of equipment around and try to keep distances. One of the blessings of agriculture is we do some of our best work out here amongst the sunshine and the fields and the green and other colored crops that we're growing. So as you know, ag, we're all at our best out here doing this. And those times when we have to work closely, we're also implementing precautions. But as I've expressed to all of my employees, it's key that we keep those distances and that they be cognizant at home. Our biggest concern, most of my workforce is not in the highly impacted age range, and most folks that work in agriculture don't have a lot of those pre-existing medical conditions that may cause them issues, although there are a few diabetics and folks like that, or a few folks with asthma and things that it might be a complication. So we're cognizant of that and trying to work on that. and adjust our workspace to be safe. Some of the harvest operations, though, it's much more difficult. We just, folks come to work on a crew bus, and so I do have concerns about that long term and how we'll be able to modify those working conditions with these harvest crews to make sure that they can stay as safe as possible, keep food being harvested and moved to consumers. So there's a lot of issues at play, Vance. We're worried about a lot of things. We're working on things every day and improving, trying to react to this. Hopefully we can beat the virus, as folks have been talking about, and keep the curve flat and not have it impact folks. But I've been explicit to my employees. I'm worried about their grandparents that they have at home, that they interact with daily. I'm worried about, them maybe picking something up at work from a colleague and taking it home, or in their trips to the supermarket. And those elderly family members, I'm most worried about those. And so we're trying to accurately inform folks so that they can make the right decisions day in, day out, and here at the workplace.
So, John, my favorite question to ask people, because it's so fascinating how people respond to it, is what do you think the world's going to look like in 2 weeks?
2 weeks, I think it'll look a lot the same it does today. Hopefully a few more of those folks that are out there reveling a little bit get the message, and even if they're not thinking of themselves, start thinking of their fellow man and woman, and maybe change some of their behaviors. I don't think a lot will change in 2 weeks. I think there have been a lot of changes already, but I think we're all thinking about 2, 3, and 4 months from now, what will our world look like? Maybe the days of the salad bar aren't that common anymore. It's not so much the food that's an issue. Lots of experts in that field have said, don't worry about your food. You're not going to get, virus is not going to be on here and then go to your dinner table and be an issue. So folks don't really need to worry about that. But it's more, the tongs you might handle at a salad bar, things like that, how you get your food touching common surfaces, how that might impact people over the next several months. So that's really where my concerns are.
I would never have thought of that.
Adapt.
Yeah. So,
people adapt.
John, if people wanted to follow you on social media, hear what you're talking about, how would they do that?
I'm mostly active on Twitter, but you can find me on Facebook. My name is John, John Boelts, Boelts, and that's my handle on Twitter is John Boelts, just my first and last name. And try to stay up on current events and try to share a lot of stuff that people might be interested as it relates to agriculture, food production, labor workforce in agriculture, and anything else that impacts us as Americans, and certainly here in the Southwest.
Is there anything people can do to help you with the visa challenges and the concerns you have?
I think it's just being cognizant that maybe people's perception of what agriculture needs for a workforce may not be spot on. Listen to those of us that are in the trenches. We've kind of been through the history of it for decades. We want to continue to put healthy, scrumptious food on people's plates day in, day out. We need the workers to do that. So, check out my Twitter feed. There's a lot of info there. Reach out to me directly with any questions. I'm normally pretty Johnny on the spot about answering questions. Heck, Vance, you and I just talked about setting this up yesterday. So, just try to keep up with folks. And it's certainly my pleasure to get a chat with you and your listeners today, Vance.
Thank you so much, John. Keep your workers safe and your family safe. And we'll check back in with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
You too, Vance. Keep the podcast going. We appreciate it.
I will. All right. John Boelts, everybody. Thank you.